It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this evening's DeCook Lecture in Leadership and Character Development. The Mark and Kay DeCook Endowed Chair in Character and Leadership Development was established in 2005 to advance and promote teaching, learning, service, and research related to the development of character attributes and leadership skills in Central students. Benefactors Mark and Kay Kuiper DeCook are both Central graduates committed to the college's mission to graduate students of high character, professional students who assume and develop in leadership roles in their personal, professional, and civic lives. Please join me in thanking our benefactors for their long-standing and generous support. Dr. Keith Jones, the current Mark and Kay DeCook Endowed Chair in Character and Leadership Development and Professor of Psychology, has invited our community to gather tonight to consider the attributes of effective leadership. Please welcome Keith, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Keith.
One of the great things about following Mary is that she keeps her comments so brief that gives me like an extra 45 minutes to talk. So, before I introduce our speaker, I would like to thank a number of people who have made tonight possible. First, Mark and Kay DeCook, of course. They are generous visionaries who see the importance of really character as elemental aspects of effective leadership. So thank you both again. Also, Dr. Mary Stry and Nadine Argo and the Academic Affairs Office. Their experience and knowledge are vital, and their support critical to any academic endeavor that we have on campus. So thank you, Mary and Nadine. Also, Professor Treva Reimer, and Treva is here, and then maybe she can right in front of me. So if Treva shows up, please thank her. She's the director, among many other things, director of Cultural Affairs program at the college, and also Ms. Susan Canfield, who's the director of Conference Services and Events. I'm very grateful to them because their talents exceed mine by light years in terms of being able to put together an event like this. And so they take the many moving pieces and seamlessly put them together into a great event. Last, and certainly not least, Tony Bethert and Central Catering. For those of you who came in through the back door, you saw that we'll be having treats and coffee later. That'll be during a reception and book signing that will follow the lecture. So if you would, please join me in thanking all of these fine folks. One of the best aspects about being the DeCook Chair in Character and Leadership Development is being able to work with other people who value the development of people and who also have a clear idea that other folks can actually exceed their potential. More often than not, effective leadership requires people to assume responsibilities as well as work in ways that they may never imagine themselves doing. And our speaker tonight is someone who understands that leading is not so much being a or the leader, but leadership really is about being someone who facilitates others to do more than they ever imagined themselves being able to do. And Dr. Jann Fried is a leadership development scholar turned practitioner who is deeply committed to people's personal and professional development. And she has been a member of the Central College community for more than 30 years, having a seemingly endless list of responsibilities over those years. She has been a Central College student and professor, mostly in the Economics, Accounting, and Management department. She is the former Mark and Kay DeCook Endowed Chair in Leadership and Character Development, and she set a very high bar for me, which was a little intimidating at the time, but then as I took this position, I realized just how much she had taught me in very subtle ways and how to effectively fulfill the responsibilities of this honorable position. So I thank you for that, Jan. She has also served as interim vice president of academic affairs and has been a department and academic division chair. And she's now the professor emerita in business management. And this semester, Jan is back in the classroom at Central College, and we're all very happy for that. She's teaching a course on organizational behavior, but as part of the residency that she's performing as the DeCook guest, is that she's put together a seminar on leadership for a number of our aspiring leaders. In fact, a few of them are here today. Away from campus, she is a leadership, development, and change management consultant with the Genesis Group, and she continues to be an author. Jann has authored 5 books, including her most recent, Leading with Wisdom, Sage Advice from 100 Experts. And again, copies of the book are available for sale today and signing after the lecture. So as you can see, Jann has really slowed down and is taking it easy since retiring from teaching full-time. Yet, as those of you who know her can attest, she is and always will be a teacher, because she effectively and steadfastly works to build relationships that lead others beyond anything they imagined that they could do. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 2014 DeCook lecturer, Dr. Jann Fried.
Well, thank you, and I'm honored that you're here. I know it's hard to get people out at night. And if I lived in Pella, I'd still be teaching here, so it's always good to be back. And I think I do want to give a shout out to Jane Blair here, okay? Because Jane was my neighbor growing up, and it was Jane who introduced me to the idea of coming to Central College. And when I came, I didn't think I'd stay for 34 years, okay? 4 years in college, left for 2 or 3 years, and then came back. And then even when I came back, I thought, oh, that would be good for a couple of years, and then, okay. So, you blink and there go 3 decades. So, anyway. I also want to thank the DeCooks, because through the endowed chair, I really do consider them as friends and mentors, and thanked them in the book. And so, once again, I just want to say thank you. And I also want to thank Central College, because I started this project. I should have the books are back there, but I started this project when I was on sabbatical, and or I knew I was going on sabbatical and I was looking for ideas, and so really started it in 2004, 2005. And when you look at the book, so it took a decade. And when you look at the book, you think, that took a decade? Well, let me tell you, when I was approaching publishers, I mean, I had a really thick manuscript, and publishers said, this sounds way too academic. It's way too boring. And they said, if you want somebody to read it, you need to really, cut to the chase. And so, anyway, I'm thinking about publishing a book with what did not get published. So anyway, because I think there's a lot of good stuff that did not get in the book. But anyway. So with that, I'm just going to... Okay, so one of the things that I want to share with you that I think is interesting is kind of the background to the book. How did this come about? Where did I get the idea? What did I do? And I always find that interesting. When I go to lectures, that's kind of what I want to know. But then I'm going to move into why I think our ego is not our amigo. And that's not the title of a chapter, but it kind of comes out of, it definitely comes out of the book. And then I want to leave time for questions and answers, but we want to have some Q&A around the reception, right? Okay, so I really do hope that you can stay for the reception. We can mill around and I can answer some of your questions there. In terms of sharing some of the background of the book, I knew I was going to be on sabbatical. So Jim Collins had just come out with a book. He had just come out with his book, Good to Great, okay? And he was at Drake, and he was brought in by the Greater Des Moines Partnership. And so I hung around so that I could talk with him, because I thought, I want to pick his brain. So I hung around, I'm the last one. And I share this little story with you because sometimes you have to pull out all of the tricks, okay? So I get to I'm the last one there, and I had his book already, so I wanted him to sign my copy of the book. And I said, I gave him a brief background. I teach at a small college. I'm going to be on sabbatical. Could I come study with you? Could I shadow you? Could I just hang out with you? He's in Boulder, Colorado. Could I just learn, from you a little bit? And, he really thought that was a strange question. He's like, I've never really had anybody ask me that before. And so then, at that time, in 2004, many of us carried Franklin planners. So I had a Franklin planner with the calendar, and in this Franklin planner, I had a one-page article by him with his photos in the center. I pulled this out, and I say, I've been carrying this since 1999. Of course, he sees his photo, and he goes, we'll talk. Okay? So I was playing a little bit to his ego there, and he said, call me. So I call him, and basically on the phone, on the conversation, he said, you know, my wife has just been diagnosed with breast cancer. Now she is okay, so I feel comfortable sharing the story. But he said, it's not really a good time for you to come out. But he said, what I will do is I will call you and we will talk for an hour about what your research study, what you want to do, and I can maybe help you frame this. So, and that's a big deal because I had tried to get him, or I checked into getting him as a DeCook speaker, and this was around 2000, maybe, 5, right after I got this chair, and he only charged like $45,000 for a talk, and now that was 2005. I'm sure it's much higher now, but $45,000, and for coaching he charged $5,000 an hour. So, he kind of said that to me, and I'm like, well, I work for a not-for-profit. So that's why we negotiated this deal. So anyway, and that always kind of works too. I work for a not-for-profit. So we talked for an hour, and what came out of that conversation was, he basically just asked me questions. What do you like to do? What do you want to focus on? I said, leadership. I like to interview people. And he said, the field is exploding. There's so much being written, 7 habits and, 8 principles. And he said, but who's tying it together? Why don't you be the person to tie it together? Well, then my mentor, whose name is Dr. Elmer Burak, he was a retired professor from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I dedicated my book to him. He died 2 years ago. So I called up Elmer, and Elmer said, well, you've got to narrow that down. How are you going to narrow that down? He said, what are you interested in? I said, well, I'm really interested in servant leadership. And I'll define that when we get there. But Elmer said, well, narrow it down by that and interview people and start with the biggies. And I used what they call the snowball method. So I started with people who are recognized as leaders in the field and then asked them who would fit this criteria. And I was also at the same time going through a program to be certified as a saging leader. Saging is just a fancy word for positive aging. So I wanted to go after sages. I wanted to go after people who were wise and kind and generous and mentoring others. And the saging organization, they have criteria, so I was kind of using that criteria. And I would say I ended up interviewing more than 100, but the editor liked 100, so it says sage advice from 100 experts. But I really interviewed, I'm up to about 110, and I just keep interviewing people because I like to do it. But, and I would say out of those 110, probably only a handful did I get off the phone. Now, some of these I did in person if I had a chance to do that, but many of them were over the phone. Only a handful did I get off the phone and kind of say to myself, I don't think they're really a sage, okay? So most of them were just very kind and generous. And I had only 5 questions, but my main question was, given what you know about leadership, how should I be preparing people to be the kinds of leaders that you think are needed in these uncertain times? That was my driving question. And then when they would say something, I would probe them. Well, how do I do that? How do I do that? So I called this book my Eat, Pray, Love Book of Leadership. Because when I would learn something, I would go do it. And so it truly has changed my life. I mean, and that could be a whole nother talk. But it has changed my life. And so that's one reason why I'm really kind of proud of this book, because I've lived it. And so anyway, that's kind of the background, and most of the people, almost all of them are authors. Most of them are some of the top thought leaders in the field. Many of them are executive coaches, so they're coaching some of the top people. For instance, it took me 3 years, and again, probably my main strength is persistence. So I don't give up. Now, some people, as Jann Huck would say, I nag, I bugger, but I just don't give up. And so it took me 3 years to get Warren Bennis, an interview with Warren Bennis. But I finally did it. He's in his 80s. So anyway, with that, that's kind of the background, okay? All right. So when I define leadership, I kind of concluded that my definition, after doing all of this work, is people who are in positions to influence the lives of others. Okay, now that can be a positive influence, it can be a negative influence, but I consider coaches and teachers and pastors and doctors, if you're in a position to influence others, I consider that to be a leader or a leadership position. I had a chance to interview Peter Senge, who really kind of wrote the book, The Fifth Discipline, The Art of the Learning Organization. I went to a leadership development workshop when I was on sabbatical, and only went when Peter Senge was the facilitator at MIT. And so because of those kinds of connections, then at that workshop I would say, you know, I'm working on a project, I didn't know if it'd be a book, but I said, I'm working on a project and can I interview you? His definition is, he says, you know, he asked us, he said, what other words, you know, what does a leader do? And so people would say, well, they inspire, or they aspire, or they, well, spire, the root word spire means breath, okay? And so Peter Senge says, leaders should breathe life into people, projects, programs. And so I often say, you know, when you're in the presence of that person, you know, do they breathe life into you? Do you feel fuller? Or are you choked and you can't breathe and they're taking your breath away in a bad way, okay? You know, how do you feel in the presence of that leader? Parker Palmer, someone else who I interviewed, and Parker says that, you know, the person with the power to project either shadow or light onto some part of the world and onto the lives of the people who dwell there. So again, what we're going to be talking about tonight is kind of the dark side of leadership, or the shadow side. And someone else I interviewed, Barbara Kellerman, she's at Harvard, but she wrote a book on bad leadership, she wrote a book on followership, her recent book is called The End of Leadership. And she's saying that it's not so much the leader, but followers have power. And because of the internet and younger generation, people are not as likely to follow as maybe some people in our generation. She says that leaders really need to care about and know about their followers. But she talked a lot about the bad side of leadership. And so one of the questions I often like to ask in groups like this is, how many of you have been under the influence of someone who you might consider to be a bad leader, meaning pastor, teacher, coach, parent, manager, boss? Raise your hand if you've been under the influence of anyone in a bad. All right. Well, it doesn't feel very good. Okay. Now, I like to say, and for my students in leadership, you know, the leadership seminar and organizational behavior, you've heard some of my lines before. Okay. But I like to say most people don't strive to be bad leaders. I don't think people wake up and say, you know, today I think I'm going to be a bad leader. Okay. I don't think it works like that. I think people are just not aware of the power of the ego and how it affects thoughts, actions, and behaviors. So we're going to talk, that's really what we're going to talk about. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I often have my students look this up, and if you go to workingamerica.org, I just did a screenshot, but they have a bad boss contest where people submit stories on an annual basis, and if you would read some of these stories, you would not believe it. I mean, that some of them, and they have to be true, you know, they're just outrageous. But if there weren't that many bad bosses, they wouldn't have a website, they wouldn't have a contest, they wouldn't give awards, okay? So I just bring that to your attention because I think it's kind of funny. This is kind of an interesting story because one of my former students, and remember, after 30 years, my former students are in their 50s, some of them, and this is a man by the name of Greg Gustafson. He works at Pella Corporation. And he was speaking in my class. I had him as a guest speaker. I often call on former students who are out there working to come as guest speakers. And he came in, and after we got done, I took him to lunch, and we were talking. He said, have you read the book called The Servant? And I said, you know, I really haven't. And he said, well, we have everyone at Pella Corporation read this book. And he said, I think you'd love it. It's kind of a parable. I mean, it is a parable, okay? And so I immediately, and again, anytime somebody told me something, when I would interview these sages, one question I asked, you know, what influenced your thinking on this topic? Books, articles, people, you know, movies. If they suggested it, I'd go read it. If they, you know, I mean, so that's that eat, pray, love part of it. So anyway, Greg said, you would love this book. So I went out and bought this book, and then Greg said, you know, and I loved it. And then Greg said, you know, we bring him in, I don't know, at least once a year, maybe twice a year, I'm not sure, but we bring Jim Hunter to Pella Corporation, you know, come meet him. So I managed to go meet him and then asked him if face-to-face could I interview for my project, because he definitely fit in this category as a sage. And one of the things that struck me is when I interviewed him, this isn't when I met him in person, but when I interviewed him, ever since I got the endowed chair, the DeCook endowed chair, every time I would use the word leader or leadership, I just think good. I just think wonderful. I just, very positive. And it was Jim Hunter who said, well, Jann, just because you're a leader in a leadership position does not mean you're a good leader. Now that was an aha for me. I mean, I just went, whoa. Of course I know people I would consider bad leaders, but I had not thought of that. And then that sent me down this whole path, and Barbara Kellerman, and bad leadership, and Parker Palmer, and the shadow side. So what do we really mean here? Ego, and this is another one of my sages, so I'm quoting my sages here, but ego is a deeply ingrained set of habits that keep us constantly misunderstanding our situation. We have to have an ego. We probably wouldn't be able to stand up if we didn't have an ego. So we have to have an ego, but we have to keep it in balance, okay? And Michael Carroll, he often talks about, again, he's an executive coach, and but this is his area of expertise, this whole ego development. And he said, you know, we often talk about the ego like it's something we can set on a table or set on a shelf, or, you know, he said, the ego's internal, and the ego wants to protect us. So in order to protect us, it's the ego that says, I'm right, you know, you're right, you're not wrong, I'll protect you, you're okay, nothing's going to happen to you. And so what happens is, that's why Carol says we're constantly misunderstanding the situation, because it's the ego that's like guarding us, you know, it's like bodyguards, okay, instead of, you know, really being authentic. And another definition that I like, and this came from another one of my sages, and actually what was interesting, and again, one person would lead me to another one. This I went on a personal retreat, and I'm trying to think how I discovered Dan Peterson, but he's in Colorado. It's very complicated to get there, but he owns 4 canyons. I didn't know you could own canyons, okay? But I guess it's like farmland. I mean, you know, if you own farms, I mean, he owns 4 canyons, and he calls his place Sage Canyon. That was a sign. It was a sign, okay? So his definition, he says, the ego is the difference between what you want to have happen and what is happening. It's the gap between what we want and what is. When we learn to let go of the difference, we're controlling the ego and not letting it control us. So much of this ego, we get overly attached, okay? Or, you know, and again, that whole idea of protecting us. The ego, the dark side of the ego, the shadow side, often manifests in behaviors such as defensiveness, greed, envy, jealousy, manipulation, micromanaging, overly competitive, insecurity. I don't think we like those traits, okay? But again, I don't think we say, you know, today I think I'll, you know, be defensive, or I think I'll be greedy, or, you know. I think what happens is we're not thinking about this, okay? So therefore it tends to take over. And so what happens, what we really need to do, I think, is we're human. We're going to experience some of these feelings. But when we sense them creeping up, that's when we need to, you know, be more in control. And that's a lot of ego development works on letting things go. Letting things go so that they don't eat you up inside, okay? And sometimes we have to say to our bodyguards, you need to move away. I need to deal with this. I need to be authentic. So therefore, we often emphasize, let it be, let it go. And this is like, how do we do this? Well, again, I would ask the sages, how do we do this? Well, you know, they would often say you've got to develop some kind of practice, okay? So it could be a yoga practice, it could be a meditation practice, it could just, they would say things like, you need to go on a silent retreat, okay? So I'd say silent retreat, like where? Well, you need to go to a monastery, okay? Believe me, I started going to a monastery in 2004, and I go once or twice a year. I go to the New Mellery Abbey in Dubuque, and I write about that in the book. You know, this whole idea of getting in touch with your soul and who you are. And as I was preparing for this, I don't know if any of you saw 60 Minutes last night. Did anybody see 60 Minutes? But they had a segment on Pope Francis. Now, I'm in love with Pope Francis. I'm not Catholic, doesn't matter. I just think he's the perfect example of a servant leader. And so in this 60-minute segment last night, they were talking about what's so special about it. And basically they kept coming back to, I mean, really, if I had to say, he's a perfect example of what I'm talking about in my book. Because they were saying things like, he's a perfect example of humility, which Jim Collins calls level 5 leadership, humility and humanity, that he's just really, he doesn't let his ego take over. He doesn't take himself too seriously, and people are flocking to him. He's Time Magazine Person of the Year last year. So, Pope Francis, what is it about him? Well, he's real. He doesn't, he's very authentic. And so when I'm talking, he's someone who's keeping his ego in check. And in fact, they interview a woman on 60 Minutes. She knew him from Argentina. She was a journalist, evidently, who followed him in Argentina. And she knows him well. I mean, she says, he calls me up for my birthday. He baptized my children. And she says, he's scandal. What was the term? I just wrote it down. He's scandal something. He's scandal authentic, or he's scandal genuine. I can't remember the term, but it was real interesting because, because he's so authentic and unpretentious, she says it's like a scandal, because it's not what you expect. So anyway, as I'm talking, think about that. So when we talk about letting be or letting go, another one of my sages, Angela Arian, okay, she talks about the state of letting be requires us to increase our levels of trust and acceptance of what is occurring in the moment without pushing or holding back to attempt to create a different experience. So when you let it be, again, one of the things, I didn't know this then, but as I reflect on some things, when our kids were looking at colleges, my favorite thing is to tour colleges, and we saw 14 colleges in 10 days on one trip. Honestly, you will find this interesting. We had a chance to go out east. I'm going to tell this story. I wasn't planning it, but I think it's a good story. So we were planning a trip out east, and whenever we would go on a trip, I'd say to my husband, I think we need to look at colleges. We don't know when we're going to be here again. My husband's like, okay. So we had looked at Dartmouth, and we had looked at, they liked Dartmouth. We went to Williams, and then we're going by Amherst, and we're walking right by the admissions house. Now, Dartmouth didn't have anyone to talk to us. Williams, the kids were not really that taken. But Amherst, they fell in love. So we're walking by the admissions office, and I said, I am just going to walk in and see if someone can talk with us. Okay, so I go in, and there's a young co-ed, and I said, I've got 3 kids, we're from Iowa, we don't know if we're going to be back here again. I said, is there someone who can talk with us? She said, absolutely. I said, well, they're a little young, and she said, that doesn't matter. They were 11 and 2 8-year-olds. And I just had to tell a story because she could not stop laughing. So, we get there, and they're lined up on the couch, and she's giving her spiel just like we give our spiel here, and John and I are sitting in chairs, and she said, well, do you have any questions? And one of the twins, one of the 8-year-olds, his hand shoots up like this, and she said, yes, and he said, can you define well-rounded? I think I know what you mean, but I'm not sure. So she defines, and he goes, that's what I thought, And their feet could not touch the ground. They're on this couch. And so then, another trip that we took, we were to the West Coast, and I said, I think we need to look at colleges. My husband's like, okay. So anyway, this time we got into the what they call the 5 C's. Now, the oldest was 15 and the twins were 12, okay? But we went on tours, and one of the twins remembered it. He ended up going to Claremont McKenna. So you just never know, okay? And like I said, I'm into brainwashing as long as possible, okay? Be nice. Tell the truth. Okay? So anyway, okay. In terms of letting go, then we're talking about willingness to release in the moment what might impede our progress. When we sense resistance in letting go, this may be a signal that we're overly attached. So letting be, letting go. Well, why am I even telling this story about our kids? Because when it came to the college search, we actually did get a counselor involved because I needed to get my ego out of it. It wasn't me going to college. It wasn't me picking out what was the best college. For them, it was like I had to let that go. And, so anyway, that was a long way of giving you an example of that, I guess. So what do we do about all this, okay? Again, this comes from Barbara Kellerman from her book Bad Leadership, but I also did interview her. And, she talks about, well, we need to share power, that, in terms of, it's real easy as the leader to kind of, if you go down to number 2, believe our own hype, and we just get so caught up kind of in ourselves. Leaders need to be willing to admit, compensate for weakness, admit what they can't do or don't know, and find people who can or do, which really is kind of the team effort again. One of the chapters in my book, it's not the title of the chapter, but involved in one of the chapters is this whole idea of forgiveness. And again, they talked about that with Pope Francis last night on 60 Minutes. The whole idea of, and I was talking with a friend of mine he just retired from Wells Fargo, and he was really pretty high up. And we were just chatting, and out of the blue, he said, one of the hardest things that I had to deal with as a leader was forgiving people. Because he said, if they did something and it was wrong, I wanted to hold a grudge. And he said, that was real. I said, well, you need to read my book, because I talk about that in there. The idea that vulnerability I see as a strength. And now that doesn't mean you tell everybody everything in true confession, but it just means that, when we're willing to show that we're not perfect, that we make mistakes, then others feel more comfortable like they can do that too. And I think it creates a healthier environment. Get authentic, this whole idea of really, get to know who you are and who you are as a soul, what your values are, what you are willing to do and willing not to do. Stay balanced. I talk about this in the book in terms of, it's in, I think it's in chapter 7 maybe, but this whole idea of renewal, that the sages said, if you're going to be a healthy leader and you're going to create a healthy environment, you have to take care of yourself. And it's more than just physical health, but the mental health and reflection. Peter Senge, I remember he gave the example of one of his favorite mentors and leaders, trying to think what company, I can see it. But he said, he would write a journal and keep a journal, and then often publish some of the highlights of that journal to share with others in terms of what did he do right, didn't he, what would he do differently? Because again, reflection is powerful. And then, which leads us to the last one here, be reflective. That self-insight requires continual reflection in order to learn and not repeat the same mistakes. So again, know who you are. So one of the things that I like to ask is, would you follow yourself? And that's one of the questions I like to ask everybody. Because the goal is to control the ego, not let the ego control you. Because your ego is not really your amigo. Again, if you think of it as bodyguards, okay, we have to make sure when that ego is creeping up, and it happens, and you just say, I'm not going to let that take control. I need to let go of that. And other chapters in that's kind of what I wanted to focus on tonight, but other chapters in the book, I have a chapter on how leaders create healthy environments, because part of the people who I interviewed, I also at the same time got involved with this organization called the International Center for Spirit at Work. And with the founders, she asked me if I would help interview people with her, senior leaders who were creating this kind of environment. So I interviewed many of the company leaders who had won awards for Spirit at Work. So that's one of the chapters. And another chapter that we're just now getting into in class is the whole leaders live their legacy. And so I often talk about, there's a lot of talk being done, and I'm getting asked to speak on that topic actually, leadership legacy. And when I will often ask people, when do you leave a legacy? And people will say, well, when you leave, or when you die, or when you leave a career, you're retiring. And I think all that's true. But what I discovered in this research, which again was kind of an aha, it came up over and over again. We are leaving our legacy daily. It's like breadcrumbs. So I'm leaving something tonight, every class, every meeting that happens, every conversation, somebody's thinking something. And I think when you remember that, I really do think people would interact with each other differently. Because this could be it. we might not have another conversation or another meeting. And so I really do approach life like that. And that was an aha. I had not thought of that before. So those were my prepared remarks, but I'd answer any question, and then we can, have a reception and interact. And so I appreciate you listening, but I would love to answer any questions that you have about the process or what I learned or something I said. Andy?
How would I agree?
Professor Campbell. Professor Campbell.
I love the idea of letting go of the ego, and I can tell the benefits. How would you suggest getting that across to, especially, people leaving high school? So 18, 20-year-olds, where their whole identity is based on ego, and it's very strong at that age. That's all they associate with. So when you teach them leadership, how do you get them to let go of that and accept this is correct?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I don't know that I have talked about this with that audience, okay? I know with, I teach Sunday school, junior high Sunday school, middle school, and we talk a lot about values, but, the idea of, being strong and standing on your own and not, I guess one of the things that I would do, I haven't done, but one thing I might do is talk about some of those behaviors, overly competitive, defensiveness, insecure, because all of those behaviors shut down continuous improvement. You're not open to feedback, you can't improve, you can't get better, that you have to really be open. And in order to be open, you have to kind of let down your guard. Maybe that's the way I might describe it. Letting down, those bodyguards, but letting down your guard so that you can learn. Because if you put up, if you get really defensive, you're not going to improve, you're not going to get better, you're not even going to hear feedback. So that's an excellent question. Yeah, great. President.
Have you given some thought to how this would be applied in our political culture?
Well, again, one of the things that's real interesting is all you have to do is look around. And you see all kinds of examples of egos out of control. All kinds. In fact, off the top of my head, my husband and I were talking about this the other day. I don't know if there's a nap on the board anymore. Did he retire? Or we used to have a nap on. Okay. Well, the big article in Sunday's paper about Bob Knapp, and I didn't know him. But, cousin of Bill Knapp, and of course Bill Knapp's a big deal in Des Moines, but they were kind of estranged. But the whole thing where he redid 801, or Sweets on Locust, I think it was Sweets on Locust. He really, even Mayor County says that he was really instrumental in kind of jump-starting that development to redo downtown Des Moines. And his ego got out of control, and greed, and ended up he spent almost 2 years, I think, in prison, and then just got out of, was going to get out soon, but was out on some parole and, killed himself, last week. So, again, it's just a perfect example of the ego out of control. The ego taking over, and destroyed his life, it destroyed his personal life, his professional life. So in terms of politics, again, what I would say is you see all kinds of examples of bad leadership, and the dark side, and people